said to have brought the two brothers together and asked that although one would obviously become king, that was Saud, and the younger one, Faisal, would become crown prince, they should see themselves as a partnership and should work as a team.
On November 9, 1953, the warrior who established Saudi Arabia died in his son Faisal's arms. But Faisal was not the heir to the throne.
I don't know why Saud was chosen over Faisal. Probably because he was more senior and had therefore more of a following in the rest of the family and was probably more of a unifier into the family. But he did not do well because he spent too much money too quickly and he brought the kingdom to bankruptcy, basically.
The new king, Saud, eventually built 10 palaces and in 1 year ran up $5 million in food bills alone. He gave solid gold watches to visitors, watches sporting his own portrait. They became known as Mickey Sauds.
Saud was known as a mismanager. He was not what we would call a successful manager by modern standards. The country ran into huge deficits. He had a reputation for being more interested in the leisurely lifestyle than in the running of a country.
Saud's extravagance even extended to his personal life. He had 52 sons and 55 daughters. Saud's brothers were concerned about the hemorrhaging budget, and their Wahhabi Muslim partners were concerned with his relationship with Egypt's Gamal Nasser, a proponent of socialism. Would the royal family council try to undo the will of the patriarch king? Would there be a coup d'etat?
They were worried about Arab socialism, and they were worried about Nasser's connections with the Soviet Union. The Saudis are deeply religious, consider communism, generally speaking, as atheism.
U.S. President Dwight D. Eisenhower courted the king in an effort to shift the balance of power away from the Soviet Union, with the help of his Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles.
Eisenhower and Dulles had the idea for a time that Saud, representing the Saudi state, which was receiving more and more oil income, might be a useful counter to Nasser in the Arab world.
Saud favored Eisenhower's economic aid over Nasser's movement, but the cash infusion wasn't enough. The family council moved to sideline Saud and put the crown prince, his brother Faisal, in charge of day-to-day affairs, a huge embarrassment to a sitting monarch. King Saud tried to regain power, but the deficits continued. He was declared unfit to rule and exiled to Greece in 1964.
Even who the king is defined by the family. You know, you have to be very, very subtle and very careful on how you work this out if you want to maintain yourself in power.
He simply was not up to running a country that was rapidly moving from the 7th century into the 20th century. The skills, the sensitivities, the sophistication, the administrative skills, he just didn't possess. He was a rather tragic figure.
It was Saudi Arabia's bloodless coup. The deposed king died in 1969. King Faisal had already been the country's leader for years.
President Kennedy supposedly said to Faisal, "Your Majesty, you're going to deny this, but there are slaves in your country, and I want them freed." And they were freed as a result of this meeting.
Personality-wise, they were so different. Intellectually, they were so different. Saud, the last thing one would ever have said about him was that he was an intellectual. That wasn't his interest. Faisal was very well read, paid attention to all kinds of things. He was a very wise, able man.
An austere figure with a surprising past.
I understand that when he was a young man, he was a bit of a libertine at times. I can't say how much or just where, but that was what the stories were.
In his youth, Faisal was known to live the high life, even on a humble picnic with friends.
Oh, that was hysterical. That really was hysterical. And we prepared beef hot dogs and all the fixings for any picnic, and we went to the park in limousines yet. And I'll never forget Prince Faisal got a hot dog bun, put the hot dog, and caviar, and what else all on top of it.
This was a trend that would be repeated again. Princes who break Islamic laws by drinking and carousing, who later become devout kings. Faisal soon became one of the most popular monarchs the region had ever known.
King Faisal, I think you could almost call him the idealized king. He was tall, he was very distinguished looking, much more educated and worldly than any of the predecessors.
This popularity meant that Faisal was able to launch ambitious plans to modernize the country. He built hospitals, schools, and initiated massive irrigation projects.
Faisal, more than any other king in the kingdom, is the person who actually propelled the kingdom into the modern era.
The man would work 12 to 14 hours a day, receiving petitions, seeing foreign diplomats, meeting with his cabinet. So he was unlike any other Saudi ruler I have known. He was a creature of work.
He was the cleverest king they ever had, and in some ways revolutionary. And I'll give you an example. Girls' schools didn't exist until Faisal became king. And when he opened the first one, there were a lot of protests from the ulamas and everybody else. They wanted to tear it down, and he stood his ground and got away with it.
One advance didn't go over well with the hardline Wahhabi clerics and their followers: the introduction of television. It was a hard pill to swallow for those who opposed any innovation after the time of Muhammad.
There were actual demonstrations against this wicked Western invention that would bring these ghastly soap operas showing the decadence of the West into the Holy Land. King Faisal insisted that this was an innovation which, under control, could actually enhance education and pushed it through.
One of Faisal's own nephews was killed during the ensuing skirmishes.
There were riots in the streets, and one of the young men who was rioting was a prince and was killed by the riot police.
But through his own example of piety and Bedouin tradition, he seemed to keep the extremists at bay. With his modernizations in place, he was able to wrest controlling interest of the country's oil company, Aramco, from Westerners.
Saudis started to run the oil fields. It was this, the great national asset, that Faisal felt that the Saudis should take control of themselves.
It jerked Saudi Arabia out of this medieval past and threw them onto the center of the world stage, because they were producing so much oil, so much money was coming in, that they had to spend this money in order to keep the international economy going.
A further break with the West came when Israel's neighbors attacked her during 1973's Yom Kippur War, and the U.S. sided against the Arab nations.
He felt very deeply about Israel, very strongly about that. He always insisted he was not anti-Semitic, anti-Jewish, but he was anti-Israel.
Having gotten this message that we're going to be even-handed, and 2 days later saying, and we're going to give $2 billion to the Israelis for military aid, was a breach of trust, personally.
And it was at that point that something in Faisal snapped, and he gave way to a very strong feeling that was generated by those around him, that the power of oil held by the Arabs should actually be used in this war.
As a leader in the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, or OPEC, he called for an oil embargo. Faisal made his oil minister, Sheikh Yamani, a household name throughout the world, as the Saudis seemed to be in direct control of the flow of gasoline.
It was the only card he had to play. It was the only weapon he had in his arsenal that he thought would make an impact on America. Now, it did make a big economic impact on America, but it certainly didn't change American policy.
Relations were damaged and revenues were down, but Faisal had become one of the most powerful leaders the Arab world had ever seen. But had his effort to modernize gone too far, too fast? The decision to introduce television to the kingdom came back to haunt him. On March 25, 1975, the brother of the young nephew killed in the television riots was admitted for an audience with the king.
And when his turn to greet Faisal, he pulled his gun and blasted his brain.
I was so horrified, I still am, to think a man of that caliber, a man of that dream, a man of that desire to make things better had to reach such a horrible ending.
One could argue that because he was killed, in great part because of his belief in modernity, it really made the country realize that that's what you had to do. In other words, he was sort of a martyr to the cause of the future.
The nation went into mourning. With this assassination, the question came far sooner than anyone expected. Who would take the reins of this emerging global powerhouse? With the assassination of King Faisal, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia suffered another crisis of leadership. The royal family quickly chose a successor, an uncontroversial and little-known prince named Khalid.
He became king as a sort of a compromise candidate because a lot of people thought Fahad was the de facto strongman at the time, even under King Faisal, because Fahad was sort of the main advisor to King Faisal. But Fahad, because of his reputation as a playboy and whatnot, did not always have the support of the rest of the family. So Khalid, who was thought by many people as not wanting to be king at all, sort of was made king as a peacemaker, as an interim personality until things could be sorted out.
Khalid was more of a caretaker king, unlike Faisal, who was